All right, let's talk about basic string formatting. We've talked about some very basic stuff of how to work with strings, like concatenating them, but we can do a lot more fancy things with strings. Some common use cases would be, what if we want to print a float without the decimals? So we can do this. We can print, cast the float to an integer, and we know that if you take a float, decimal, and cast it to an integer, it's going to truncate all the numbers off after the decimal. So that's a simple, but what if we want to do something fancier like first rounding it up? And here's another. What if we want to line up information into columns? So we know we can print or write to a file by taking a string and then concatenating it with a tab marker and then another string, and that will put a tab between them. But what if one of them is very long or short? If you look at tab delimiters between columns in like a Microsoft Word document, you'll notice that the tab can be in different places. It's like every ½ inch. And so if you have one very short thing and then one very long thing right after it, the columns are not going to be lined up. So what if we want to not only make sure there's a tab between them, but actually line them up visually so they look nice when we print them out either to the console or to our file? If we're just going to use print and some of the things that we know so far, it's going to take a lot of extra work to do these things like rounding up floats or lining up columns. And there's a much easier way to do that, which is string formatting. So your book talks about one way. I'm going to talk about another way. There's actually other ways to format strings, but they're very similar in their templates and what you can do. And it's very useful. So things that we can do here is align the text to left, right, or center. We can create padding around information, extra symbols that fill in spaces. We can choose what we want that padding to be. So you can think of like in a table of contents, sometimes they'll write the title of the chapter and then have a bunch of periods and then the page number. And the page numbers are all lined up and there's a different number of periods in those spaces. So that would be an example of padding. We can also control the precision of floats, how many decimal points we want to show, and whether we want to round up or round down. But in this case, we're actually just going to talk about rounding up. So automatically rounding up in this particular video. So here's our basic anatomy of string formatting that I'm going to show you. We have, and we're going to use print statements here. Let me get my little spotlight so you can see this better. We have a string, and we have a method .format, and that method has an argument, which in this case is a string literal with the word world. And notice that in here we have some curly brackets with some notation in it. So this is our basic anatomy of string formatting. It's made up of this string that's going to be printed. And then inside those curly brackets is the details of how the formatting will be applied when we print the string. And there's some notation in there which we're going to learn that tells Python how to handle this formatting. The name of the method for formatting that we're going to be looking at is, surprise, surprise, format. And its argument is the information that will be formatted in our string right here. So this is a basic anatomy, basic pattern that we're going to use. And there's a few things here. So this particular thing is going to print out hello world with 2 asterisks on both sides of it. So how do we get to there? So this, first of all, there's a few things that we need to learn. First of all, we can't just throw data types into our format method. We need to tell the formatting what type of data it's formatting, or at least how it should be handled. We don't necessarily need to tell it's a type, but if we want it to handle it in a certain way based on the data type, we need to let it know. So there's 3 specifiers that we use for that. The first one is D, which is for integers, and then F for floats, and S for strings. So F and S are pretty intuitive, F for floats, S for strings. The only one that's not intuitive is the D for integer. And we use that because it's actually borrowed from other programming languages. It's actually common specifier for integers across many languages. And I like to think of it, to help me remember, is D for digit. It actually stands for decimal, but that doesn't make sense since we have floats. So D for digit is an integer. So let's look at examples of formatting our three data types. First of all, the integer formatting. So if we have here a variable with an integer in it, we can add it to our string by doing the curly brackets where we want to add it, dot format, and then our variable as the argument to dot format. And that's going to print out welcome to 1200. So essentially it's doing the same thing as if we had just concatenated, well, first cast 1200 to a string and then concatenated. That's the default behavior here. So nothing's been specified. We haven't told the format method with these brackets how to handle the formatting. So no formatting is applied. It just kind of does the business of casting it to a string and then concatenating it together by default. However, we can do fancier things. So here we're actually going to specify that we're working with an integer with a D, and we're adding this number in front of that, and we also have this colon here. And this is going to print out welcome to 1200. And notice that there's an extra space here, maybe a little hard to see, but there's, instead of one space, we have two spaces. So what's happened here is we've used this number here to specify how many character spaces we want to take up. And in this case, we specified 5, which is more than 1200. It only takes up 4. So the formatting method has added padding there as of an empty space by default to the left. So that's one thing we can do. Another thing we can do is add a 0 before the 5. So this is very similar to our previous command, but we have a 0 before the 5. And what this is going to do is print out something very similar, but instead of that extra space as padding, it's not going to be padded with zeros because we specified a 0 before the 5. So that's very nice. If you want to keep your numbers lined up to the right of whatever your column, you can use this to add padding. And you can specify what that padding is. So that's integer formatting. And this is the template for integer formatting. First of all, we can create leading zeros. It's optional. Then we use this number to format the minimum number of digits displayed. So we'll do at least 5. If the digit itself is longer, it won't cut those off, but it will make sure that there's at least 5 digits. And if it's too many, it will pad it, in this case with zeros. And then of course we have the curly brackets, open and close, that's required in the string, the colon, and the D specifier to say that we're working with an integer. And note that in actual code, you don't want to leave spaces between anything. I've put spaces here between the curly bracket and the colon and the 0, etc., just to make it easier to see on the slide. But actually, you would not put spaces between these characters. So that's integer formatting. There's your basic template for working with numbers and formatting them into your string. The next thing we can do is floats. So if we start with a variable that is a float, we can do some things with that. Now, this particular command does not include the data specifier. And notice what you get. So you have the string, the midterm average was, and then our curly brackets with some specification, but without the F in there to specify that we're working with a float. And so by default, it's doing this funny thing here to print out the number. So we want to, if we don't want to see that, we need to put the F in there to print out the float. And you'll notice that there is slightly different to the integer formatting. And we'll look at the template here, but let's see if we can compare this with the next command and if you can figure out on your own what this notation is doing. So in this case, we have colon 2.0 and the F to say we're working with float, and we get 22. We can change that slightly. And in this case, we have same thing, except in the curly brackets, we have 3.1. And in this case, it's printing out 22.3. So notice the difference here. Here we've got 2, point, and 0, and here we've got 3, point, and 1. Now let's look at one more, see if you can figure out what's going on, and then we'll talk about it. Here we have the command 1, point, and 3. Now, you may have guessed already what's going on here, but let's go ahead and look at this and then see what the result is, see how this comes out. So what we have is two numbers and we have a decimal point. That's not the decimal point we want to print out. This is the one we want to print out. It's an argument to format. But this is saying how we want to format that decimal point. So in this case, we have 2 digits before the decimal and 0 after. And that's saying that we want to see a minimum of 2 digits before the decimal points and none of the digits after the decimal point, which is exactly what we get here. In this case, we have 3 before the decimal point and 1 after, which is giving us at least 3. We actually have 0, we have the dot, which is included, and then the two digits, and 1 digit after the decimal point. So that's what this formatting is telling us. So what's going to happen here? We should have at least 1 digit before the decimal point and no more than 3 after, which is in fact what we get. 22.341. So notice that floats will never lose the numbers before the decimal points. The number that you're specifying in the formatting notation is telling you the minimum that you want to have, including the decimal point, but it will never cut off any of the numbers before the decimal. The number after is going to be the maximum, so it will cut off. So let's look at this. Look at a few more here. So in this case, we have 1 and 5 with F. What's going on here? So in this case, we've not put anything. We don't have a dot. We haven't put anything after the dot in the formatting here. We just have a 15. So it works very similar to the integer. It's saying how many minimum spaces we want to allow for this number. And it's not going to truncate anything off here. It does add a 0 at the end, but it's just padding this whole number with the leftover spaces. So it's count however many digits are here, and then it pads with what's ever left to add up to 15 spaces. Very similar to the integer formatting. In this case, we've got our number and then a 0 in front. So if this works similar to the integer, we should see those spaces before the 22 filled in and padded with the 0, which indeed we do. So that works the same as well. So adding a 0 in front will make the padding be 0. Same thing with integers. Here's another one. Here we actually have the decimal point in the notation. We don't have any number in front of it, but we do have 9 after it. So this kind of does kind of the flip. It's going to make sure it includes all the numbers that are before the decimal point, in this case 22, and then it's going to include a maximum and up to 9 spaces after the decimal point. And since we don't have any more digits after that last 4, it's going to pad those extra places with 0. So we have 9 digits after the decimal point. So too many digits after the decimal point. So specifying more digits than you have decimal points in the number is going to pad that with trailing zeros, never with spaces, by the way. All right, here's our float formatting rules. Very similar to the integer, but we have the 0, we can create leading zeros. We have the minimum number of total characters displayed, which by the way includes the decimal point. What's different from the integer formatting rule is that we have the decimal point in there, and then we have a number after that, which as you've seen is optional. It will do different things whether you leave these numbers off, but that's going to be the maximum number of digits after the decimal point. If there's more, if you specify more than there are actually digits in the number, it will pad that with trailing zeros. And note that if you, however, give less than you have numbers after the decimal, so if you have 5 digits after the decimal and you put a 3 here at the spot, it's going to it's not going to just truncate after the 3rd digit that follows the decimal. It's actually going to round. So it's going to round up to that 3rd place after the decimal. So it's either going to automatically round or it's going to pad with trailing zeros depending on how many numbers you have and what you specify here. And once again, I put spaces in here to make it easier to read on the slide. You would not want to put spaces in the code. Lastly, we have strings. So we can actually choose how to format strings in strings. By default here, if we don't specify anything, we just put the curly brackets in our string with the dot format and then use our string variable here. It's the same as what we saw with the integers. It's just going to work like concatenation. It's just going to concatenate that variable to the string that we have and just put them together. That's the default action. However, we can do some fancy stuff. So here, very similar to what we've seen before, we've got a colon 7 and then the S to specify that we're working with a string, which indeed we are. Dogs is a string. And it's going to do something very similar to what we've seen. In this case, it's going to pad the spaces to the right between the two words. So if we can do that, if we can pad the spaces around strings or between the two strings that we're putting together, then we should be able to add zeros and pad that with zeros, right? Well, actually not. It's not going to work that way. We cannot. So this is different from the floats and integers. You can't use zeros to pad strings in your formatting, unfortunately. So this is one difference. Other than that, there is a way to do this actually, to pad with zeros, but it takes a trick which we're not going to look at now. So just basically that's just to see that's a difference between the string formatting and the float and integer formatting. So the string formatting is very similar to the integer. We have a minimum number of characters to display, which can add padding if that's necessary, and then the string specifier, and of course the curly brackets open and close, and the colon before all of that to indicate that we need to format this.